Today we are going to talk about a debate method known as comparative advantage, which I believe is the most effective way to debate an opponent or to give a public speech in an undergraduate level public speaking course. The idea of comparative advantage can be found in this Stephen Lucas textbook, The Art of Public Speaking. This is the 12th edition that I use for my classes. In that class, it's found on page 320 and 321. It's actually a relatively short section, so I want to take a moment to just elaborate on some of the ways in which I think this can be extremely helpful. So when you're given a speech in an undergraduate class, you usually have to organize your speech into 3 main points. With comparative advantage, there's a specific way to organize. The first main point is going to be whatever your problem is, right? And so every person in your audience should agree upon what the problem is. You should only be laying out facts and stats that everybody is going to agree on with regard to truthful information. In your second main point, what you do is you lay out your opponent's solution. When you're laying out your opponent's solution, you want to offer up the best argument and the best evidence for why your opponent is actually correct. You don't want to do what's known as straw manning the argument. You don't want to give a very weak argument for your opponent, because then your opponent can come back and say, actually, that's a very weak argument. I have a stronger argument for my position. So before your opponent's allowed to make their strong argument, you want to make their strong argument for them. And then in your third main point, when you offer up your solution, then you get to offer up these ideas as to why your opponent's best argument is actually incorrect and why your solution is better. And we're going to run through a few different examples in the next couple of slides. So if we think about politicians arguing over policy, they're usually arguing with regard to 3 questions. Questions of facts, values, or policy. Now, questions of facts and values, most people agree on what facts and values are with regard to whatever it is they're debating. Most politicians don't argue over facts and values. They actually agree on what facts are, for example, issues of gun violence, issues of immigration, which are some examples we're going to give on the next slide. They actually all agree on what these problems are, what these questions are, and these for you should be addressed in your problem section. So under your first section, you should say, look, here's what the problem is, and we all value X, and then we start to argue over what the policy should be. So this is where most people differ, is regard to question of policy. How do we change our policies so that we can all reach the values that we all share? So a couple things get to happen when you use comparative advantage. The first thing it does is it shows your audience that you respect them enough to do all of the research. So if I go into a debate and I only know my side of the issue, it actually tells my opponent that I don't care enough about the issue to learn all sides of the issue, and I'm not a very educated person with regard to the argument. So you want to show your audience that you respect them and you want to do all the research. And then tell them, after I've done all the research, I actually think that my solution's the best. The next thing comparative advantage does is it shows your audience that you trust them enough to give them all the information, and then they can make up their own mind. And this is done by what's known as steel manning the argument as opposed to straw manning the argument. So steel manning is to make the best possible argument. Steel is hard to push over. Straw is very easy to push over. So if you steel man the argument, you make the best evidence or the best case using the best evidence for your opponent, then your audience thinks that you are arguing in good faith. So you want to have an honest debate with your audience by giving them all the information. If your audience leaves the auditorium and then they later find out that you misled them, you omitted some facts, you didn't present the best argument for your opponent, then your audience feels misled, and they're not likely to trust you, and they might start to distrust all the other information you gave them. But by giving them all the information, you build trust with them, so even if they disagree with you, they think that you're arguing in good faith, and you can keep a good open line of communication with them. The last thing comparative advantage does, which is what I really like, is that it disarms your opponent because you've already addressed all their issues. So if you are arguing with an opponent in a face-to-face debate and you get to go first, in that second main point, you're going to lay out the best argument your opponent has, and then in your third main point, you get to tell your opponent why they are wrong. Then when it's time for your opponent to go, your opponent is only laying out arguments that you've already addressed. So it disarms your opponent because they have to reconcile the idea that you've already destroyed all of their arguments. So, a good example of this that I use in my classroom is the movie 8 Mile. So I show this in my classroom, the final rap battle scene, because Eminem's character, right here, he gets to go first in this, we're going to call it a debate for a moment, right? So Eminem's character gets to go first, and he gets to run through all of his own faults that his opponent's going to use against him. So rap battles, they get very personal. They use a lot of ad hominem attacks against each other. Eminem just bluntly puts it all out there. So he gets 2 minutes to do his part on the rap battle, and he takes the first minute and he says, "These are all the things my opponent is going to say about me." He's going to talk about how him and his crew, they all beat me up, they had sex with my girlfriend, that I live in a trailer with my mom, that I'm white. Eminem runs through all of these arguments his opponent's going to lay out, and then he addresses them, because then in the last minute he comes back and he attacks his opponent. So he says, actually, I might be all of these things, and those are things that make me look like a chump, but here's all the problems with my opponent. And so he does this in the last minute. What ends up happening, and I would recommend looking this scene up on YouTube. In the end, Eminem's opponent, right here, he ends up getting the microphone and he just walks off stage, because he realizes that he is just going to offer up these arguments that Eminem already addressed, and he has nothing new to say. And if he starts laying out these arguments, the audience isn't going to listen to him, because Eminem has already addressed all of these arguments. So 2 quick examples of what comparative advantage could look like. I've chose political topics. This one I'm going to use a more Republican position, and for immigration I'm going to use a more Democrat position to keep it nice and balanced. If we look at the issue of gun violence, and your first main point could be, here's the problem. You lay out facts and stats about gun violence, and you also talk about values, so no one wants anyone else to get hurt. During the problem section, you should be talking about things that everyone agrees on. Right, so this is how many people have died every year because of guns, and nobody wants anyone else to get hurt because of guns. Then I might offer up my opponent's solution. So let's talk about getting rid of all guns. My opponent says that we need stricter gun laws. In this argument, I might talk about the Australian model or the UK model for gun control, and talk about why these laws have worked in other countries, and maybe we should use them in our country. Then I get to my solution, and my solution might go into, look, my opponent wants to get rid of all guns and have stricter gun laws, but what we see is that when areas that have really, really tough gun laws, they're actually more violent. So I might pull up city statistics where gun crimes are pretty regular, even though they have strict gun laws. I might talk about how it's unfair to treat law-abiding citizens as criminals, so we shouldn't take away guns from people who are legally doing lawful things. Maybe we should allow law-abiding citizens to carry guns, so we need looser gun restrictions and regulations. And maybe I offer up, maybe we need to have more safety classes. All right. On the issue of immigration, so I might say, here's the problem. The problem is about 12 million people are in the country illegally, and we want a fair and just system, right? We want fair and just laws, right? So these are things that everybody says. Now we're going to have different opinions as far as how do we define fairness and justice. But we'll get to that in the second 2 points. But all politicians are going to say we want fair and just laws. And the 12 million statistic, that's close. Most numbers I've seen is somewhere between 11 and 15 million. But for the most part, most politicians agree that there's about 12 million people who are in the country illegally, and that we got to find some sort of fair and just way to solve this problem. Right? Now I get into my opponent's solution, and my opponent might say, look, we need to deport everyone. If you came to the country illegally, you're here illegally, and you have to go home. All right, and I should do a very good faith argument. I don't want to do what's known as an ad hominem attack. I don't want to attack my opponent's credibility or I don't want to attack him or her personally. I want to attack their argument. So I lay out their best argument possible for why we should deport everyone. And then I get to my solution. I say, look, people are already here. If we deport everybody, people are just going to come back tomorrow if they're desperate enough to be here. Deportation might end up separating families that are of mixed legal status. So instead, maybe we need to have some sort of 20-year process where people go to the back of the line, and then in 20 years they can have some sort of citizenship, etc. Right? One thing that's really important for both when I'm arguing my opponent's solution, I want to talk about their best solutions. I don't want to just offer a bunch of ad hominem attacks. I don't want to call them names. I don't want to say that they're idiots. I want to say that these are their best This is their best evidence that they have, and then in my solution, I get to say why their evidence isn't going to lead to solving the problem, that my solution is actually a better approach to solving the problem than my opponent's.